one of the puzzles of Trump's second term so far. It's been American allies that have suffered more coercive economic threats than Russia has. Trump does have the ability to cut off any individual, any company, any entire country from the dollar at the stroke of a pen if he wants to. I actually don't think China's strategy is to replace the dollar. They're trying to build this shadow infrastructure. If we in the West don't do anything to disrupt its growth, then China might be emboldened to take aggressive actions against Taiwan or other countries. I worry that this uncoordinated, haphazard economic warfare is going to build a new economic order right before our eyes that we didn't necessarily want.
This week, we're going to take a look at economic warfare and how it's changing the world.
I dug into all of this, in fact, the topic of economic warfare with Edward Fishman, who wrote this book, Chokepoints. He's director of the Greenberg Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And his theory is essentially that the US has a lot of these choke points on various parts of the global economy, mainly because of the US dollar, but also other American infrastructure as well. And so I started off by asking him for his take on the latest blow to Trump's tariff plans.
So look, I think the Supreme Court ruling is a substantial hit to Trump's entire economic strategy, because he's viewed tariffs really as this kind of cure-all for a lot of America's problems. He's viewed it as a primary way of raising government revenue. But I think that the single biggest challenge is if you look at Trump's foreign policy, because he's really viewed tariffs as his go-to economic weapon for really any crisis, any instance where he really wants to try to enforce his will on a foreign country. He's used tariffs as a threat, right? We saw it even last month with the whole Greenland crisis with the Europeans. So I do think that sort of magic tariff Sharpie, where he can just kind of sit in the Oval Office and immediately threaten a tariff on a foreign country, that is substantially circumscribed by the Supreme Court ruling.
And so what message does that send to the likes of Moscow and Beijing?
I mean, Moscow and Beijing, I don't think it sends very much of a message to. I mean, Moscow has not been a primary victim of Trump's economic coercion. I think this has been one of the sort of puzzles of Trump's second term so far, which is that, if anything, it's been American allies that have suffered more sort of coercive economic threats than Russia has, right? We've only seen two significant sanctions actions against Russia in 2025. They were both big, right? They're sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. But if you go back to the 3 years between the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, almost exactly 4 years ago, to the beginning of Trump's second term, the U.S. was doing a full new package of sanctions every single week. So Trump has really dialed down the pressure on Russia. And then with respect to Beijing, there was a big escalation with Beijing last spring. For a little while, the U.S. had 145% tariffs on China. But when China retaliated with export controls on rare earths, it completely changed the game. And Trump sort of pivoted from being this China hawk to being a real dove on China. And we've seen a lot of backpedaling on Trump's economic pressure against China.
What are the tools at his disposal because of this control over the various systems?
Yeah. Oftentimes we think about economic tools in sort of legalistic terms. Sanctions are, when you're blocking an individual person or company from the US dollar. Export controls, you're stopping US businesses from selling specific goods to a foreign country. I actually think that the more apt way to look at it is in terms of these choke points, which are these parts of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes. The choke points are distributed around the global economy. The U.S. controls the most important ones, but China controls some, other countries control some. The U.S. dollar, by virtue of being involved in 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, being sort of the default medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value around the world, is probably the most potent choke point in the global economy. And despite the Supreme Court ruling, Trump does have the ability to cut off any individual, any company, any entire country from the dollar at the stroke of a pen if he wants to. So that's not something that was circumscribed by this ruling.
And when it comes to China, it obviously doesn't control the dollar, but it does control a lot of rare earths mining and processing. It does have the potential to, let's say, invade Taiwan and have a chokehold on semiconductors there, because you rightly say that US companies like NVIDIA designed them, but a lot of them are made by TSMC in Taiwan, for example. And on top of all of that, China has invented ways, such as the digital renminbi, to have a kind of an early model of something which could potentially allow it to trade without relying on US controlled or influenced infrastructure. So is the dollar really the killer control mechanism that it once was? It remains the dominant form of foreign exchange, but yet there are all of these other ways where China has these chokeholds, these choke points, I should say.
I mean, the dollar is very secure as the global reserve currency. I think almost to a frightening extent, right? I mean, you saw last year all of the chaos sown by Trump's unpredictable policies, and yet the dollar really hasn't lost all that much ground. I think the hype has really outstripped the reality on that front. I actually don't think China's strategy is to replace the dollar. It's really to provide an insurance policy. It's to sort of to build parallel infrastructure so that if there is a crisis like a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, where maybe China is fully cut off from the dollar, that they could scale up that parallel infrastructure rapidly. So I don't think they're trying to build a replacement. I think they're trying to build sort of this shadow infrastructure that'll allow them to kind of survive in that crisis scenario. And I think on that account, they have made a lot of progress. And I do worry that as time goes on and that infrastructure continues to build, especially if we in the West don't do anything to disrupt its growth, then China might be emboldened to take aggressive actions against Taiwan or other countries in its neighborhood.
And your book maps out the kind of the history of various forms of economic interventions, economic warfare at times. It's described as being a kind of a replacement for conventional warfare, but that it's not always been successful. So where does economic warfare work? Where doesn't it? Why don't we, for example, see Russia snapping into line due to US sanctions, let's say?
The challenge with this question, sort of do sanctions work, is that we seldom articulate clear goals for economic warfare. And really, the efficacy of sanctions on Russia, for instance, depend entirely on the goal you ascribe to it, right? If you ascribe the goal to Russia's sanctions that they're meant to deter Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which I would say was the goal leading up to February 2022, clearly they were a failure, right? I mean, if you didn't have sanctions in place, Russia would be much stronger economically and militarily. I think we forget that going back to 2014, before Russia first invaded Ukraine, and I was involved in designing and negotiating those sanctions back then. Russian state-owned enterprises, the big banks, energy companies, defense firms, they had $700 billion worth of external debt that was denominated in dollars and euros. They were being financed by European and US financial institutions. The technology that was drilling for their oil, that was running their entire economy, was coming from places like Silicon Valley and Germany. We were powering their growth. And so certainly by virtue of being cut off from all of that since 2022, in large part, they're much weaker than they would have been otherwise.
And it's interesting. I spoke to a few industry leaders at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos about European sovereignty specifically. And it looks like Europe is just caught between China and the US in a way which it cannot extricate itself from. Because if you even look at the sovereign cloud inside Europe, it is dependent on a US AI stack. It is dependent on Chinese-made chips. And so could it be that the end result of Chinese and US dominance is that Europe has a pretty poor future ahead of it?
Look, I understand why the perspective from Europe may seem bleak when put in those terms. At the same time, I think the Europeans oftentimes don't understand their own strength. Think about Europe as a bloc. If they act together, they're the world's second biggest economy, right? They rival the U.S.
But they can't act
size.
Together is the problem. They can't. The U.S. The U.S. president can act unilaterally. Xi Jinping can act unilaterally, but Europe has to get the consensus of dozens of people at various levels, not just the leaders of the member states. But it seems like an impossible task for them to be able to leverage the choke points that they have.
I think it's an impossible task for Europe to act as a great power. But isn't it an impossible task for Europe to act with sufficient unity, that they have economic security, that they have economic prosperity? No, right? And a lot of these instruments that they have built, like the anti-coercion instrument, I think, for instance, that rests on qualified majority voting, right? I mean, you could advance retaliatory sanctions against China or the US if need be without unanimity in the EU. I think also if I were a European, I'd be at least somewhat optimistic about this new idea of enhanced coordination, right? Where you might have sort of a vanguard of EU member states that decide to go ahead with something like capital markets union or joint debt issuance or other things that maybe the Hungarians or the Slovaks or somebody don't want to join. I think that's necessary, right? I mean, if the Europeans do act in everything where one country can veto it, yeah, they're going to be useless. They're going to be completely feckless. But that hasn't been how it's worked in practice, right? I mean, look at competition policy, trade policy. There are a number of key competencies where you can't just have one member state veto. I think the other thing too, maybe like a word of optimism for you guys. Although I will say, I'll admit that sitting in New York, maybe it's easier for me to say this than if I were sitting where you are in Berlin. But look, I don't think economic security is the equivalent of self-sufficiency. I think this is actually something that people don't appreciate, and I think it's a really big risk, frankly, everywhere, not just in Europe. If we say that the only way we can be economically secure is if we make everything ourselves, if all of our cloud is based on our soil, if we only use our own currency, that's hopeless. And then final point I'd say, and this is another really important issue, is there's this concept sometimes that's brought up called weaponized interdependence, where countries weaponize interdependence against each other. I don't actually see that. I don't think that's what's happening. What actually happens,
for example, with Russia and Germany was far too dependent on its gas flows, cheap gas coming into Germany to fund its industry.
So sure, but I guess what I'm getting at here is I don't think states typically, if they have a choice, weaponize interdependence. What they really do is they weaponize dependence, right? They weaponize areas where they have dominance, where they have a monopoly position. Remember, I said the U.S. has 90% of foreign exchange transactions, right? If you're cut off from the dollar, you're out of luck, right? You gave the analogy I gave in the book. But between the U.S. and Europe, it's not a relationship of one-way dependence, right? It's not like Europe is totally dependent on the U.S. and we in the U.S. have no dependencies on Europe. It's actually on the macro level a relationship of interdependence. I think Silicon Valley tech companies, like Meta, earn a quarter of their profits in Europe. So just think about that, right? What would happen if those profits were to go down even by a little bit because of additional regulation or taxation? I mean, it would pop the tech bubble in the United States. It'd be terrible for the U.S. stock market. I mean, there are a number of these areas where Europe has a lot of leverage over the United States if it's willing to use it. And I think what we've seen in the U.S., the Achilles heel of American economic warfare, it's not our offensive capabilities, it's our political will. It's our ability to actually sustain a 2% decline in the stock market. We haven't shown a great ability to do that in the U.S. And I think that's something that if the Europeans really could get their act together, they could probably use that to their advantage.
Okay, my final point is for you to, if you could, look into your crystal ball. Where do you see the state of these choke points going, especially even beyond Trump? Do you think that we're heading into a situation where the US is going to be more and more willing, or even find itself compelled to exert its force more and more as China seeks to push back against US dominance?
I think the big questions, for us in the US and frankly for you in Europe is, do we allow this sort of haphazard process to build a new global economic order? Or do we just have a new global economic order built through haphazard, uncoordinated acts of economic sanctions and industrial policy that are done in Brussels and Washington and Beijing, Tokyo? Or does the West come together and say, this is the new global economic order we want to build? This is how we actually secure economic security in this period of heightening global geopolitical competition. And I think if we do that, maybe we can get to a better place. I worry that this uncoordinated, haphazard economic warfare is going to build a new economic order right before our eyes that we didn't necessarily want.
And that was just a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, where we cover money stories that cross borders.
If you'd like more, just scan the QR code at the bottom of your screen and you can listen to full episodes and subscribe.